Hey everybody, I'm back with another video demonstration for you today. In this demonstration video, I'm going to show you guys how to use the multiply blend mode to start building onto your current rendering or value blockings. So in a couple of videos before, I showed you guys how important it is to basically place values or local values or local tones into your illustration, either through the line art or just building it from the thumbnail on. So what we have here is Jason's illustration. I think Jason's illustration is coming along really nicely. The local values have pretty much been set. He is establishing, the foreground, the middle ground, and the background by using those same values. Having the darker foreground here, so it'll get lost in the foreground, so it won't take too much of the focal point from the main character in the middle, and also adding a little bit of atmospheric perspective, or the atmospheric elements to basically push that background back. So we're not getting as much details in there, and also the atmosphere, basically like, the sky, the mist, or what have you, is obscuring a little bit of the finer details compared to the character who's the hierarchy, in terms of hierarchy, the main focal point in the whole illustration. So really good. But where do you go from here, right? If you find yourself kind of stuck on where to go from here, my favorite thing to do is to use the multiply blend mode to start basically enhancing what is currently in the illustration, the current tonal values and or local values. Now, we are going to get into the blending modes a little bit more throughout the semester, as well as starting with the portrait project, which is coming up soon. But right now, I'll give you a little bit preview if you haven't used it before using the multiply blend mode. Now, if you've probably seen in prior videos, the multiply blend mode can be found in two places. First, let's start a brand new layer here. It could be in the brush, like if you click on the brush and the brush options bar, you're going to see the multiply blend modes here. I say ignore that for now. I'll go into it a little bit further next time. But what the blend modes that you want to use can be found and should be found in the layers panel. So if you go to layers, it says normal, click on that, then those are your blending modes. By default, it's going to be set to normal. But then you have different categories here. You have the normal category, you have the darken category, which basically darkens the image that you currently have in your document. And then the next one is lighten, basically the opposite of what darken does, right? And then the fourth one is the special effects and saturation modes, basically overlay, soft light, hard light, which creates really nice effects on your illustration. Allows you to do like stuff like glow, lighting effects, like more nuanced stuff. And then the sixth one, something I don't really use much. Or sorry, the fifth one, something I don't really use much, like difference, exclusion, subtract, divide. I don't really use it much in my illustrations, so I'd say ignore this category for now. And the last one is the color category. Basically, it allows you to generalize, like a general broad placement of color over your illustration. Again, these are really cool. It'll be hard or basically almost impossible to composite in Photoshop without the use of the blending modes. Well, not impossible, just like super hard to do. So these stuff is really good to add color to something, add color to value grayscale, which we're gonna do in the portraits, which I'm gonna show you. It'd be hard to like place something under a composite, like another image, into something or textures, patterns, and what have you. So this is a really powerful feature in Photoshop. But right now, again, I'm going to show you guys how to use the multiply and maybe even lighten and overlay for right now. So As I mentioned here, Jason's illustration looks pretty good. The values, most of the values are pretty much placed in there. But now we're going to try to bump stuff up and start building using the multiply to darken areas and then maybe overlay or lighten to add some of the more lighter areas, like the lighting and stuff. So here on a brand new layer, I'm gonna, oh wait, actually the first thing I'm gonna do, looking at Jason's illustration, I wanna bump up the levels real quick, or the contrast. What I'm going to do is make sure you select it. Let me unlock it first. Image adjustment levels. So basically what we're going to do here is to bump up the contrast and make sure some of the details come out a little bit more. So right now everything is a very grayish tone, right? What I want to do is to bump up the dark areas a little bit more. So if you look at the levels, going to image adjustment and then levels, let's start again, image adjustments and levels. You're going to come up with a histogram here. So you're going to see all these little sliders, the 3 sliders. You're going to have the dark slider, the midtone slider, and the highlight slider right over here. So if you look at your histogram, you're going to see that Jason does not have a pure black area. So it's missing that part here. And most of it is within the range of like the dark grays to mid grays. So let's change that. Let's mess around with the levels a little bit to make sure that everything's gelling together really well. So maybe I'll bump up the dark really quickly and let's move the slider to the edge of that histogram. And already we're bumping up all the dark areas, including the one in the foreground. Next, maybe let's get rid of some of that mid-tone gray. So let me move up to the right, see what happens. I darken it. Maybe that's not what I want. I want to brighten it a little bit. So let's move the opposite direction and then bump that up. That looks pretty good. And maybe the highlights could do a little bit of pushing too. So push that here. Just mess around with it however you'd like. You just want a clearer cut of the dark areas, the midtones, and the highlights, or the lighter areas, and press OK. So if I hit Command Z, you can see the difference, how gray and flat the values are, compared to how the darker areas now pop, as well as the highlight areas, right? So next, let's build it out a little bit more. So looking at the foreground, which is right here, middle ground, and then the background, I could see that Jason is doing really good here by placing the highlight areas and the darker areas here. Because, you know, Jason wants that character to be the focal point, more noticeable than the foreground elements and the background elements, or the foreground character and the background character. But the problem here, though, is that if we're looking at it like separating the values between dark, medium, and light, this shadow area here is a lot darker than what we find in the foreground. And because of that, there's a bit of a discrepancy here, right? This one jumps out a lot more than the foreground, than the foreground element itself. Because the foreground element is just a grayish value compared to the super dark shadow here. So what we want to do is probably take our light elements. So let me choose a shadow element here. The soft brush, create a brand new layer. Now, I said we're going to use the multiply, but for now, let's use lighten, right? So what I want to do is lighten those shadows out. So what I'm going to do is hold down an Option or Alt, pick the surrounding values like this gray, and just paint it in there. See what happens. Command D. Select it, there you go, and just paint that out. So what lighten does is basically whatever you paint here is going to lighten the darker value. So let's say we choose white, and if I lighten that, it's going to lighten that value to try to get it to the level of white. Now, if I choose a darker value than the areas that you want lightened, then it's not going to work because it's darker than the areas that you are lightening up. So you have to choose a lighter values than the areas that you're lightening in order to lighten it up. So I'm using the pen pressure here to sort of gently, I guess, kiss, quote unquote, kiss that area so that you're lightening that texture. Now you want to be careful because you could go overboard with this, because if I press really hard, then I basically replaced it with that value. But using the pen pressure, I am lightening that area up. Here and here. Excuse me. Now I'm not sure if Jason has this in separate layers, but if not, then you have to work in different layers so that you can isolate different areas, right? So, like for example, the background here, we're gonna do something with that as well. So basically, right now, I'm just lightening all those areas. See now, if I turn this layer off, see how much that stands out compared to here. So now, since we set this one as the mid-tone and light, there's more atmosphere. I don't know if you guys, some of you guys know the atmospheric perspective. It's basically the atmosphere from here in the back to closer to us. It gradually dissipates as it goes closer to us, right? The atmosphere is like the little particle, the amount of air particles or sunlight, light, what have you, between us and the object that we're looking at. So if we're looking at the foreground one, we're not going to have as much particles in between us because it's really close. So this part here shouldn't have as much atmosphere as the areas back here. Because the atmosphere, the thicker that it is, that it makes the thing all the way in the back appear really desaturated and a lot lighter and fuzzier looking compared to the areas in the front, which is going to be a lot darker or more true to color because it's right up in our face, right? Alright, so what we're going to do now, since we set this one into a more mid-tone, and of course you could always change it later because you could always build upon that and correct it along the way, we want to add more values to the darker areas right here in the front. So, creating a brand new layer, set it to multiply. Again, multiply darkens the, as opposed to what we did here, which to lighten the darkened area, we're darkening the lighter area. So you have this thing here, right? In order to darken this value, then you have to choose a value darker than that to help darken it. And multiply acts differently in that it multiplies the surrounding areas, everything, right? So it really just takes a lot of playing around with for you guys to figure out how those, one, blend modes affect the other values underneath, and two, how other blend modes affect other blend modes. So there's a lot of playing around here, and with practice, and you guys, it's going to come second nature to it, how something affects another thing. But for now, multiply to add more shadow to this one. So I'm going to use the hard brush. I'll just use black for now, just to get a general shadow on top of it. And using the hard brush, I'll just paint that black. I'm just paint that whole shape out. You could definitely spend a lot more time than I am right now, but I'm just trying to show you guys so you don't have to spend too much time on it. Alright, so right now it's just black, right? So now let's use the opacity here to lower that opacity layer. So now it's a lot darker than it was before, right? But I want it to be darker than the shadows appearing here, so I'm going to bump it up even more. Like so. So what's the difference between multiply and this? If I set it to normal, it's very flat, right? You're not going to get a nuanced shadow on top of it. Rather, it's just going to sit flatly on top. With the multiply blend modes, it's going to affect every single value underneath it a lot stronger. Now, it doesn't appear too different now because the values underneath are already pretty dark. But if we set it and paint over it on top of this, see how much more, how it affects the different values underneath that. If I set it to normal, especially if I set it to much a higher opacity, it's not going to be as noticeable. So multiply itself is not very noticeable, but once I start adding in stuff like color, let's say here, C set to normal and then I lower the opacity. But if I set that to multiply, it's gonna almost add a gel-like color right on top of the overall illustration. So set it to normal and mess around with it. The other thing that's great about setting it to multiply is that if I create a brand new layer and set it to multiply again, then I could continue building different transparencies on top. So here's black. I'll set my brush into a pen pressure with opacities by clicking on the toggle here. And then I am going to keep building those shadows, those details, the line. I could even use a soft brush a little bit so I could get a little bit more variety if I'd like. And just, you can lower the opacity so you could build on top even more by like going over it a bunch of times. So multiply is a really, really good thing for that. So I say I really like how this looks. I'll merge everything together, create a brand new layer, set it to multiply again. I could then work on my character. And from here, I use that multiply to just keep on building. See how much that is better? Now you already established the shapes underneath it and the the actual rendering. Everything's pretty much already done. Like the base, Jason already pretty much set up everything, like the character, the basic rendering. So now I'm just using multiply to continue adding some of the darker values in there. And using the multiply and the opacity at a lower percentage, I can build on top and just keep doing so. And I can erase it as well, and so on. And the great thing is it's on a separate layer, I can throw it away and it won't mess with my original drawing underneath. And you can also lower the opacity if it's too strong, initially too strong. And then multiply. Another great thing to use that multiply blend mode with is to use it for shadows. So Jason pretty much set it up where the light is coming from the sky up here. So now I can use that to my advantage using that separate layer set to multiply. I can do a general shadow. So remember the basic shapes that you guys just did? So his head is just a sphere, right? So you can treat it like a sphere. So you have the shadow, like let's say a full shadow here. If the light's coming from the top, and like the sphere, the lighting is going to look like this. I use a soft brush here. So now it's on a separate layer, set to multiply. You can lower the opacity if you'd like. And there, easy shadows. You can basically just do what I'm doing right now, start painting it on, or you can use, let's say, like the lasso tool on a brand new layer and just isolate the shape. Let's say go to the body here. When you're using the lasso tool, you want to hold down on the shift key if you want to add on to your existing selection. I'm kind of terrible here, so I have to add on to it like that. Or you have to click on the option or alt key to take away. So existing selection plus holding down shift, or to take away from the existing selection, hold down an option or alt and it becomes like a minus sign. So I just want to add on to that. Alright, so I could do this, right? Selection, brand new layer. Make sure you're not painting on top of the original painting on an empty layer here. I'll take my paint bucket, paint it black, Command D or Control D to deselect. I'll use my opacity, which is set to multiply, lower the opacity, and there's your shadow. But since I have lighting to take care of, I can just use, let's say, the shadow, a soft brush, and just, oops, sorry for that, erase away the areas that I want the light to hit. Instant shadow, and since it's set to multiply, it's going to affect every single area really nicely. So the important part is what Jason has done is to set up the drawing already. This will work a lot better if you already set that up so that you can just place the shadow using multiply on the very top, and then all the details will still show through. Right? That's pretty cool. And then I could create another layer for the other ear if I'd like to. Hold down on Shift to add. Or you could easily just paint it on. You don't have to do the lasso tool if you're not comfortable using it quite yet. And then for this one, I placed a layer underneath this layer. And I'll just add a shadow here. So that it's behind that there. Oh, sorry about that, guys. I have a cat on my computer. Alright. See, that looks pretty good. Now, once you start introducing stuff like layer masking, that will work even better, right? And again, a little bit more advanced. We'll get into that a little bit more in the coming weeks or modules. Command D to deselect. It's too harsh. Lower the opacity. There you have it. That's the multiply blend mode. Like we already went over overlay a while ago, but the same thing. Let's start a brand new layer for the Lighten stuff. So first, let's just finish this up a little bit. The one in the background. What you want to do is add some details to the background as well, because that's what you really want, right? So set it to multiply. I'm going to use a hard brush with the opacity toggle turned on. And I will reinforce some of those shadows. It's okay because we're going to use atmosphere here to basically, you know, add more depth to it later on. But right now I'm just using the shadows. And by the way, I'll say this over and over again throughout the semester. Use references, guys. It'll help you so much in your structure, style, lighting even. But use references for the folds and the clothes. It will help you such a great deal. See, that's pretty much just set to multiply, and I could, with a lower opacity, I could continue building right on top of them. And you can multiply that. So now we could use overlay. Again, overlay adds really cool lighting. So set this one to overlay. And to use overlay, use lighter values or colors on top of the current ones. So for example, I'm going to do a general one here before I make this video too long. I'm going to use a soft brush here. Set this one to, let's say, white. And set that layer to overlay. So now I can start adding in a little bit of highlight. Since set to overlay instead of normal, I can just do like a broad stroke. See how cool that is? That lighting, it affects every single value that you have underneath. Now, the best thing to have done here is to not leave white areas. So the best thing to do is to take a layer, set it to multiply, and just fill this in with a value. It could be a light gray value if you want. Don't leave white areas, because if you set it to overlay, it's not going to be as cool as, it's not going to affect the white areas as much as something with values in it. So let's go back to our overlay layer, set it to white here. And now you can add in more layers to that. So you want some value underneath here, not just white. And then going back here, maybe I can add a little bit of, let's use the hard brush here. A little bit of lighting so there's more dimension to the character in the background. I lowered the opacity just a little bit more so I could be a little bit more sketchy about this. There you go. And sometimes for the background character, that's totally enough. We could obscure that with something else so that, you know, the important part is the character in the foreground. And then merge everything together. Now, in the end, after you do the stuff using multiply, overlay, lighten, you always want to go back in there because those blending modes, as awesome as they are, they will not solve the things that you need done 100%. You still have to go back in there with a normal layer and continue painting. Like stuff like this, like the halo effect, you can't use blend mode to get rid of that. So you have to go back in there, use the Option or Alt to pick up colors and just clean it up. Using like a hard brush and just clean those up manually. So stuff like that you can't really avoid. You have to go back in there and actually do that. So it's always going to be like a work in progress as you go along. Hopefully Jason have everything in separate layers because it makes things a whole lot easier. To isolate things and work on things separately. But if everything already just flattened out like this, if everything's flat, then you have to use some of the selection tools or just go back in there and just carefully, you know, clean edges up. Like stuff like this, like little archives here, probably created when maybe the paint bucket tool was used or what have you. So you still have to go back in there and just manually do stuff. Like manually add some more shadows if you need to. So bump up some areas. Clean it up. Maybe add like a reflective light. So if the light's coming down here, it's going to hit the shoulder. It's going to bounce back up. Kind of like the sphere or a cylinder, like the basic shapes that we did. And maybe add some light here. Add some light. And there you go. Now play around with those blend modes just to begin with before we head into the portraits assignment and just familiarize yourself with those and the technique that I just showed you today. Once you get that down, I think the other blend modes will come in really, really easy, much easier, especially when color is introduced. Alright, that's pretty much it. Hopefully this helps you guys out as you finish your first project. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, anything really, please tag me, let me know, and I'll try to get to you guys as soon as I can. Alright, thanks everybody.